hi on Instagram if anyone is there. And I believe Facebook is now also live. Hello, hello. Just going to make that a bit bigger so if anyone does ask a question, I can see. Hi, everybody. So, we will see how this goes. It's officially 1 o'clock. Hi, King Says Theatre. Very good. Great. Well, it is officially 1 o'clock. I suppose I should start. Okay, I've had to write this down because I am not used to being in front of the camera. So I will see how we go. Feel free to ask any questions if you've got any. I will try and answer them as I go. I'll also try and leave a portion at the end for any questions you might have, and we'll see how we go. I'm going to tell you a bit about how I became a set and costume designer and my process of how I design a show. For those who don't know, my name's Louie Whitemore. I'm a set and costume designer. I work in theatre, dance and opera, as well as site-specific pieces and events. I'm going to, as I say, just talk to you a bit about where I came from and how I ended up doing what I do, and then a bit about my process, and hopefully, as I say, answer any questions if you have any. I've got Facebook on my laptop and Instagram on my phone. Hopefully I'm not doing ping-ponging too much, but anyway. For those who've not come across my job before, in the loosest terms, it means I take the creative lead in a team of people that make the world in which action takes place for a particular performance. That also includes the costumes. I really love making work that sort of provokes a reaction. It can be a tiny reaction, it can be a massive reaction, it could be experienced as a group or individually, but I make work that hopefully leaves an audience member thinking and discussing what they've just seen. I try and avoid someone leaving going, that was okay, or it was fine. You can't always predict what the reaction would be, but I want those watching the work that I'm involved in to feel or think something once they've watched it. In terms of my involvement with the King's Head, I designed firstly the Bicycle Men a very long time ago with Dan Castellana, Joe Liss, Mark Nutter and John Rubano, and more recently I've just done Buttons, a Cinderella story with the fabulous Charles Court Opera. I did the set, not the clothes on that occasion. I sort of stumbled into design. I wasn't really sure at school what I wanted to do. Who really knows what you want to do at school? I knew that I wasn't very academic, and I certainly knew that my job would not involve maths because I'm appallingly bad at it. And thanks to a very persuasive drama teacher, I started to think that I could be the world's best stage manager. That was the plan. So at the age of 15, I joined the National Youth Theatre, the technical course, which for any youngsters out there starting out, I could not recommend highly enough. It's absolutely fantastic. I found myself working on shows at the Lyric Hammersmith in London during my summer holidays, which is a hell of a long way from Watermillock in the Lake District, a sharp learning curve. I did drama at school, and I was always the one doing everything backstage. I hated being on stage, so I found it all rather nerve-wracking, much like this, despite my attempts. I never did art at school. I can say with some confidence that I can't really draw. But as I explored the world of design, I realised, or thankfully I was taught, that it's not about being a fantastic drawer, it's about being able to communicate your ideas to as many people as possible in a very clear way. I went on to do a degree in Technical and Production Arts at the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama. It's now the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, based up in Glasgow. Thankfully for me, it was an entirely practical degree where you would spend sometime in each role that you would find backstage in theatre. So I did scenic painting, I did carpentry, I rigged lights, I made sound effects, I made Greek Orthodox priest hats for 2 weeks in my costume allocation. And you also had to design and make a model box for a fairy tale, which was a bit of an eye-opener. It was, in total, all of that experience was invaluable because it means that I could understand the role of each individual in creating an overall production. As a designer now, it means I can have a clear conversation about what I'm hoping to achieve in each particular area. It also meant, starting out, I could paint my sets and I could help make my sets and I could find the props or make the props, which to this day I'm still doing on some of the smaller projects. And if you're starting out in fringe theatre, it's essential. You don't have a vast team of people. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. Hopefully you'll graduate having lots of people, because there are always people that can do it better than you if that's their particular individual skill set. But it's very good to have a sort of base grounding knowledge in all of those things. Then in my final year of my degree, you specialise down into 3 areas. You have design, I chose design, lighting design and stage management, thinking I would still be a stage manager, but I might as well have fun doing a bit of design, because I'm not going to do it ever again. In the last year of that degree, I worked as a stage manager in London, but then I also designed 2 shows up in Glasgow. One was 12th Night and the other was Howard Barker's Bite of the Night. I was proud of the shows, but the main thing was I really loved the process of getting a team of people together and creating this thing and presenting it to an audience. The collaboration that was involved as part of that was the bit that I really loved about being the designer, and that hasn't really gone away. I then found myself thinking, well, maybe I should just apply to a couple of courses, and I applied to Bristol, and Royal Welsh wasn't quite as big as it was then, and I found myself on Motley's theatre design course, purely by fluke, I think, to some degree. My interview was appalling. I think I realised halfway through the interview that I really wanted to go there, which is possibly a little bit too late, but thankfully it wasn't, and I managed to get a place there. Initially, I hated it with a passion. We were in this freezing cold studio in the back of Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, with rats and spiders the big as your hand. And I just didn't understand what I was doing there. We had the Christmas break, I came back, and I designed Henry V with Jonathan Munby, and it's just seemed to fall into place. For whatever reason, that project clicked in my head, and ever since then I've been designing. I've in my 14th year of being a designer. I don't know what's going to happen next, but hopefully we will learn from this process and I'll be back at work before we know it. I've been fortunate enough to have worked all over. I've worked in opera houses in Germany, I've toured large chunks of America, I've done shows in refugee camps in Palestine, I've done Shakespeare in Urdu in Pakistan, and the first ever all Chinese Noel Coward in Beijing. So thankfully my work has been extremely varied and kept it quite interesting. Many of those companies that I work for as well have been people that I first worked with as a work experience girl back in the day. So that's a little bit about where I came from and how I ended up becoming a designer. And so no questions yet, that's fine. I will just move on and chat a little bit about my process and how I start with a particular project. So I think every designer has their own process, and rightfully so, because no 2 people think in the same way. I'm just going to talk you through a little bit of mine, but you should never take these things for verbatim. If you're an aspiring designer out there, it's about finding your own toolbox of stuff that you then use to problem solve and create a show. I start, sounds really simple, by reading the text. If it's not a piece with a text, then I might start with the music or just an inspiration. But primarily, I start with reading the play, the text. I note down all the obvious things that are mentioned in the text. So items of furniture, bits of props, bits of costume elements, characterization bits that give me an insight into what a character might be like and therefore what they might wear. Once I know that, I can then decide along with the director what version of the story we want to tell, what we need to keep in there to tell that story, and what we don't need to keep in there, what we don't need to use, or what we don't need to visually represent on stage. It's a little bit like being a detective, because you have to nitpick down and find all of that information. I believe you can't eradicate something without knowing why it is there in the first place. I'm in the business of telling a good story to an audience. That's what I'm trying to do. And if I'm not telling the story that's in the text or in the music, then I don't think I'm doing my job right. I try and remember that at all times. It's sometimes quite hard to not get carried away, but primarily that's what we should always have at the root of the work that we do. I then take that information and create a storyboard. I just sketch a storyboard. So despite not being a confident drawer, I do not let this hold me back. I create just rough sketches of a storyboard. I'm going to show you a picture. Stickmen, it's all stickmen, not very complicated. And it's about reading the text and filling in the world around the performer. So this is from a production called The Last Temptation of Boris Johnson. Seems a bit apt. These are a couple of sketches that I made. Hopefully you can see that. That's Instagram camera, Facebook camera. And what I'm doing is I'm going through the text. I always start with a person. Oh, it's like being a weather girl. Start with a person and then draw the space around them. So, for example, if the text says someone walks in through a door, I draw the person, then I draw the door. There's an element of instinct as to where it ends up on the page, but it immediately gets you thinking, well, are they coming through a door? Are they coming through from a black hole? Are they coming through a trapdoor? Are they flying in from above? It's just a device to get your brain ticking through all of the things that you could do with a design. And I do that throughout the whole text. So from start to finish, I'll storyboard the whole thing and I'll end up with a rough picture in my head. That picture might be what it ends up as. It might just be a starting point that never sees the light of day. But as I say, it just starts to get your brain ticking about the piece and about the movement of the performers within a space. I then go a bit old school and I go to a library. I mostly don't know what I'm looking for when I go to the library. I go to flick through books and see what I find. It could be loosely related. I might start with picking an art period that is related to when the text is written, or it might be just pot luck and I go to the sculpture section and I flick through some books that look interesting. I have never not found an image that has spoken to me about a piece. I don't always know what it is about that image that makes sense to me, that relates to the text that I'm working on, but it gives me a way into the next step. It gives me a feeling and a starting point. I could use the internet, and I do use the internet, but when you use the internet, you have to have some sort of initial starting search term, which immediately cuts off an amount of things that you could find, which is why I prefer to go to the library and just see what I get. It's much more potluck. So it's a little bit more of a voyage of discovery, which I think leads to hopefully more interesting end results. I then move on to a model. So I would make a black model box of the space that we're going to perform in, just a basic black model box, and that is normally in a scale of 1 to 25. If you're in America, you might work in a slightly different scale, normally 1 to 25. If it's a big opera, sometimes, or ballet, I might start with 1 to 50, mainly to save money on materials, but also it means that you can get through ideas quicker because you're dealing with a scale where you can rotate through ideas a lot quicker. I basically fill that black box with shapes. I rip up card and I model with card and create a space. I then drop in bits of model furniture to basically storyboard again, but with 3D elements. The model is really important because the model provides a central point of conversation that everyone can refer to. Once I've got a sketch model, I use that to sit with the director and the choreographer and go through the piece again and communicate with them what I've got in my head. That's a lot easier to do with something that's 3D. It's much, much harder to do with a 2D sketch or a 2D drawing. It means that we can also invite that director and choreographer to get involved and put their own input into the model. Once we have that sketch, we refine it down and down and down until we get the final design. We eventually are adding in colour and texture because that all feeds into it. We also want to think about lighting positions and how a lighting designer might react to the space. I always try very hard and get a lighting designer involved in the process very early on. It's not always possible, but it's very useful when they do. You also have to think about sound. Have you got a live band on stage? Do you need to hide some crazy big speakers? You want to think about that then, not standing in a tech rehearsal 2 days before the show opens and someone walks up to you with a meter square speaker. Extreme example, but it does happen. Once I've finalised that design, it's a process of taking it on to realisation, and that's where hopefully you will get some help. It's a case of getting it approved by the producers via initially a white card model, so that's the model of the final space but without all the paint and the fine detail, and then you would go with a final model which is exactly what you want it to look like but in miniature, and then eventually it's the first day of rehearsals. Before you know it, it's a tech rehearsal and you're on. So that is my process. Obviously there are some variants because it depends very much on the project that you're taking on, whether it's theatre, whether it's dance, or whether it's opera. They're very different things, but the basis of that process that I've just spoken about remains the same for me. That is how I find a way in and come up with a design. The space or the spaces that you're designing for, you obviously have to take that into account at the top of the process. Is it in the round? Is it end on? Is it traverse? We're not so sure. Is it touring? Does it have to fit in a big van? Does it have to fit in a tiny van? Is one person putting it up or 10 people putting it up? Is it a repertory season? So are you designing one show in the middle of 4 shows? How does that fit with everything else? How does it fit physically in the building? Budget, the boring word, but I think it's important that it is thought about, mainly because I believe you will get the best design you can if you can design for your budget. If you're working middle to low scale of theatre in particular, you're going to get the most realised version of your work if you think about the budget when you're designing. It shouldn't ever hold you back, and sometimes I have to fight that, but it shouldn't hold you back, but it should hopefully give you the most realised version of what you are aiming for. And then finally, the audience experience, not just site-specific theatre. An audience member comes in, takes their seat, and often sits for 15 minutes before the show starts. What are they looking at? What are they listening to? What is that experience? It should be thought about and designed from the second they come in to the theatre space. I think that's really important. Fine. What else? I hope I'm not rattling too much. Apologies. I think I've got a question. I'm just going to check. Yes, I'm getting to that one. I will get there. I'm sorry. I will. Now that I sort of chatted about my process, I was just going to talk to you about a couple of shows. So what I was going to say is I've got some pictures on my iPad because I can't screen share, but you can also look at these pictures on my website, and I've just put the link into the chat. So if you're interested, you can look on there. I will hold up my iPad, but I'm also getting some funky reflections, so apologies. In regards to those sort of constraints I just talked about, I've picked some shows that hopefully describe what I'm, will physically show you what I've been talking about. So first off, the Theatre by the Lake summer season 2019, all three main house shows, which were Lady Killers, directed by Chris Honer, Rise and Fall of Little Voice, directed by Zoe Waterman, and Dear Uncle, directed by Tom Littler. They're in a repertory season. You've got 3 to 4 hours to turn between the shows. You've got 6 crew, and the crew change daily. You have to be able to return the theatre to a completely black box. You have a limited space of storage. You're actually given meterage as part of your contract. And you have to fit 3 really big shows that run for 5 months into a space. So I'm going to try my best. I have been practicing this, but you get a reflection of my bad garden. Oh, there we go. So this is a house that we created for Lady Killers. That same house we were able to use for Little Voice. We created a frame, and then we had elements of that frame that moved and switched around. Instagram, hopefully you can see that. Right, so Lady Killers is 1950s, and then Little Voice is 80s. So you can see that the basic shape is the same. We still have a kitchen downstairs, a bedroom upstairs, but for example, the stairwell has changed. The windows have disappeared from the walls. An outhouse has disappeared from the exterior of the house. This was a way that we could quickly turn around between shows, but get a fully realised design for each individual show. We then had Dear Uncle, which was the third piece, which went incredibly abstract. Was because it suited the piece, but it did also help with the storage. So all of these elements had to be taken into account when we were designing. Hopefully you can see that. If you can't, please do look on my website if it's of interest, because you can see all of these pictures on there. Then we've got English National Ballet. So ballet, very little set. But you have, with ballet, you obviously, primarily, you have to think about space. They need a lot more space than a normal performer who's delivering a straight text. You also have to really think about clothing choices. The dancers obviously have to move. It sounds silly, but dancers move in a very different way to how we move. And you have to think very carefully about seams and elastic and underwear. Do not forget the underwear. They will not forgive you. Then I've got an opera, Messiah. I mention this because I did the costumes, but it was improvised. The characters didn't exist. We created the characters along with the performers. Those performers did a series of rehearsals where they came up with characters. I then interviewed them as their characters and created their clothes. This is a picture of the set. The set was done by David Roger. It was for Frankfurt Opera and for the Royal Danish Opera. And David Roger did the set, in fact, just because in total we spent 2 months coming up with this piece, and it was a bit too much for one person to do set and costume. Then I couldn't not mention German Street Theatre. I'm the associate to the building there. It's an incredibly niche studio space in the West End. It has a playing space of 3.9 metres by 7.8 metres, no backstage and no storage whatsoever. The toilets are across the stage, and so you have to maintain that accessibility for the audience members at all time. And you can come up with, you could think, oh, that's really daunting, I can't do anything in that space, that's crazy, but actually you can do loads, and those constraints make you as a designer have to think out of the box. So I've done shows that are super naturalistic, where is a full-on kitchen where we've cooked liver and served wine and beer and eaten dinner. We've done 9 shows in rep in a day, each with an individual feel. That was tonight at 8:30, directed by Tom Littler. We've done a bedsit, original Deaf Rabbit, directed by Hannah Yoss, which was rotten food in takeaway tubs and all sorts. And yeah, I mean, everything in between. The Beckett season that we just did with Trevor Nunn, that was another triple bill in the course of an evening. So you really have to think out of the box about how you might sandwich these things together. It's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle and goes back to start of the process where you have to be a detective. Finally, I'll just mention 2 other pieces. Lancastrians, which was, I mentioned because that was a verbatim piece. It was directed by Liz Stevenson, Junction 8 with a theatre company, and that we had no text, we had no starting point whatsoever. We interviewed hundreds of Lancastrians, took their interviews, improvised a piece, and created a piece of theatre that toured to the county of Lancashire. It meant that it had to all fit in the back of the van, and the sizes varied. It was all predominantly non-theatre spaces. So community halls, village halls, kitchens, you name it, it went there. So I had to design something that could expand and contract depending if and when it was required. The audience had to also sit within the space. The performers performed around them. This is, God, I'm so bad at that, sorry. That is the space, so that's all the stools that the audience sat on. And we sort of created a ring around them. It meant that we could do exactly what we needed to do in terms of the variation of the spaces. Finally, just to show the variation of stuff, sometimes you need to design something that you have no concept of whatsoever. I designed Stuart Lee, content provider. He comes up with a comedian with a sketch, as it were, and not sketch is the wrong word, but a stand-up set. And I created a world that loosely related, but gave us a feeling for the piece and the comedy that he was talking about. So work and things can come from anywhere and everywhere, and the design, you always have to change. So in terms of that, my aesthetic, I would say, varies too, because it's about creating the story that's required for the piece that you've been asked to do. I would never say that my aesthetic is a particular one thing. I would say I get drawn towards the simplified and the abstracted, but whatever is needed to tell the best possible story is the thing that's what we should be doing at the end of the day. I don't have any questions from anyone, and I've got 2 minutes left. I never thought I would fill that time. I suppose if you want any other work to look at that hopefully backs up what I'm talking about, I would look at the wonderful Ralph Coltai's work. He's an astoundingly amazing designer, sadly no longer with us, but personally I don't think it gets much better than him, or it hasn't yet. And the other would be Alison Chitty. I know I'm biased, she did teach me, and Ralph Coltai taught her, but in terms of people telling clear, decisive, clever stories, she is very, very good at that. Ashley Martin Davis would be the other person who's very good at that. So, no more questions. I have a minute. I hope I haven't just bored you senseless. I do feel like I've just rambled, but hopefully it made some sense. If you are interested in design or getting into design, or are designing currently, I know these are scary times, but we're all in it together and we just have to keep trucking. feel free to contact me via my website, or I'm sure you could track me down via Facebook or Instagram, whatever suits. And I guess the only thing that remains is to say thanks to the King's Head. As scary as this was, I'm very glad that I did it. Yeah, thank you for doing it. I think it's a great series of events, and I've tuned into a few myself. I've learnt quite a bit, and I hope you just keep it going. I've got one question. How are you remaining creative in lockdown? I'm very creative with my DIY. I have honestly found it very hard to be creative initially, but we find our ways, and I can make a good cake, so maybe that's where I'm being creative at the moment. That is 30 minutes, and as I say, if you want to get in touch, please track me down. I will help with anything if I can. It was lovely to speak to you all. Thanks again to the King's Head, and I will now awkwardly turn off the 2 videos with hopefully not too much pause. So Instagram first. Thank you very much, and yeah, I'll hopefully see you soon. Thanks very much. Bye.